We heard Steve there talking about the difficulties of imposing a curfew, but these emergency measures have been put in place. Is there a rationale for the Hong Kong government to do this? Is it likely to prove effective, do you think, in containing the protests longer term?
I think this was a real political miscalculation by the Hong Kong government to invoke a colonial-era set of ordinances that essentially grants the government sweeping powers and greater government authority when the crux of the protests that have been going on for months is actually the desire of people to have greater freedoms, I think was bound to inflame the situation further.
So what is the off-ramp then? There's a sense that the government had to do something or else they would be perceived as incapable. What are the off-ramps now? Well,
I think that the government needs to show more good faith efforts in going further than they have in addressing the 5 demands that the protesters have made. And we saw this when the government first said that they would pull back the initial legislation, that the protesters' response was essentially we had 5 demands, not 1. So I think the government really needs to demonstrate that they're, rather than leading with pressure and trying to coerce people to end the protest, that they're making more of an effort to meet protesters and address the fundamental concerns that they have.
So if the government gives in to say one more, and everyone virtually talks about the second one potentially being this independent inquiry, but the protesters, as you mentioned, want all 5, what gives the government reason to believe that the protesters will stand down if they give in to that one?
You know, I think that's a gamble that the government needs to take because, frankly, at this point, the route that they've been taking hasn't worked. And I think there's very little to indicate that just further efforts to pressure and clamp down on protest is going to lead to a successful result when it's essentially only inflamed and exacerbated this crisis over the last few months.
Lindsey,
Lindsey, in terms of how this is all playing out in the halls of power in Washington, we have, of course, seen moves to support the Hong Kong protesters there from some lawmakers in D.C. But does the violence of the protesters, of some of them at least, a minority, does that undermine their cause in Washington and beyond?
Yeah, I think that the escalating violence is certainly a concern here. And no one wants to see the violence further escalate. And I think it's important to note that the vast majority of the Hong Kongers protesting over the last few months have done so peacefully. And I think that that's one reason that you saw such support for their cause. And so I think it's important that the protesters refrain from violence, but it's also incredibly important that you see the government step away from some of the really hard-handed tactics that they've used thus far, rubber bullets, tear gas, and this week we saw protesters being shot. So on both sides, I think it's incredibly important to de-escalate. For the protesters, the real risk of violence that I think is particularly concerning is that greater use of violence on their part really raises the risk that the government and that the mainland could feel compelled to step in to put down the protest in a more violent way. And that would be a deep concern.